Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and it is time to talk about another chapter. Chapter 23, The Gilded Age. Now, again, the Gilded Age stands for the fact that from the outside, America looked wonderful. We were making all kinds of money, building industry and railroads. But for the people living here, it was a time of struggling. The Gilded Age itself is synonymous with corruption. And that's one of the major issues we face throughout it. So, moving on through the chapter. Election of 1868, General Ulysses S. Grant becomes president. He will end up winning 2 terms. The reason why the Republicans selected him is not only was he going to win because of his success in the Civil War, but he was also very naive when it came to politics. They can get whatever they wanted from him to convince him to pass along anything they wanted to get done. So during the Gilded Age, leaders like Ulysses S. Grant and Congress allowed for a lot of corruption to occur. And corruption was not just in one facet of our society. It pretty much was inside of everything, from politics to business. Farmers were manipulated and controlled by it. Our cities were taken over by it. And I have a list there: businessmen, politicians, carpetbaggers, Indians manipulated by Indian agents. So many people were affected by it. This included criminals like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, who cornered the gold market in 1869, basically bribing the brother-in-law of Ulysses S. Grant. They nearly corner the gold market before the government releases gold into the market. Regardless, that shows what men were willing to go to and the ability they had to control politicians to get it done. Boss Tweed in New York City is one of the most famous corrupt figures from the time period. He pretty much controlled New York City through his political machine, Tammany Hall. He recruited immigrants and police and judges, and everyone was on his payroll, to where he stole nearly $200 million in taxes from that city. And this is a political cartoon about him. A guy named Thomas Nast draws enough cartoons and brings enough awareness that eventually Boss Tweed is put into jail, where he passes away. The Credit Mobilier scandal is in Congress. Congressmen used the land grants and money made from railroad building and to make a lot of money, basically using their position to steal tax dollars from Americans. And eventually they are censured, although both the men in charge of the scandal are eventually reelected. Then the whiskey ring, you have a group of people who, rather than paying their taxes on their whiskey businesses, simply bribe the tax collectors. Eventually, Grant's private secretaries investigated, which just tells you that the scandals across our country go all the way up to Congress, all the way up to the White House, not just in large cities like New York City or businesses. Needless to say, this was a major troubling time period. Despite all of these challenges, men were often reelected, including Grant, who soundly won re-election in 1872. So, looking at the economics of the time period, even though there was a lot of money being made, we weren't without our struggles. Over speculation of railroads, as that was the most popular thing to invest in that time period, they were not perfect, and so they also had some crashes. In 1873, this over speculation hit people in America pretty hard. This caused many Americans to argue for more money to be printed. Why? Well, the more money you have available, the easier it is to pay your debts off. Naturally, banks and financial institutions would be against this approach. So since this is the Gilded Age, who wins out in the debate over what we should do with currency? Do the people win out, or do rich financial institution people win out? Obviously, Grant takes the businessman's side because, again, this is the Gilded Age where people suffer at the expense of politicians and businessmen. And the amount of money actually decreases from 1870 to 1880. In other words, there was less money in people's hands and available to the entire country during this time period. So what happens is debtors, or people who owed money, began focusing on a separate issue. They wanted currency to not just be based on gold, but they wanted to be based on gold and silver. This would cause inflation, just like we talked about a second ago. The more money that was available, the easier it would be to pay their debts off. This will end up being a big part of the election of 1896, when the populists make a big push for the presidency. So in other words, this comes up in a future chapter pretty strongly. Power politics in the Gilded Age. No party held power for long in this age. Basically, you see a constant tug of war between Republicans and Democrats. The wave of public opinion, the reaction against different political schemes and political corruption causes it to constantly switch sides. Democrats focus their efforts on the South and Northern immigrants. Meanwhile, the Republicans focus on freedmen and Civil War veterans. You see GAR there, that stands for Grand Army of the Republic. And basically, the Republicans used those veterans, those couple million soldiers, to help them win several elections throughout this time period. Both parties used patronage, founded by Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s. Basically, you hand out jobs to your supporters to gain an edge over your opponents. By promising these jobs, you pretty much make people run for you and support you just because they're going to get something from it. And that, of course, leads to, no surprise, a lot of political corruption. So switching gears a little bit, people cared more about political power than they did about the people that they were helping. And so this brings us to a major turning point in our history when Reconstruction comes to an end. In 1876, Republicans had controlled the presidency and controlled Congress. But at this point, Democrats are finally making a big push to recapture both parts of the government. So in the presidential election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican candidate, seeks to replace Grant, while Samuel Tilden tries to win for the Democrats. And what happens is we end up with basically a tie for the presidency. In the Compromise of 1877, Democrats end up giving the election to Rutherford B. Hayes. Why would Democrats give that up? Well, Hayes and Republicans promise that if they allow them to win, they will allow Reconstruction to come to an end. What does this mean? Well, it means that unfortunately African Americans in the South, these newly freed men, are going to be left at the whim of white Southern legislators and Democrats. Republicans have simply grown tired of dealing with the pushback from Southern Democrats, and so they decided to just leave them alone and allow Southern states to do as they pleased. As we all know, this will result in some pretty awful consequences for African Americans in the South. So this is, you can tell just by this map alone how divided we were as a nation over this issue. It looks fairly similar to the maps leading into the Civil War. Here is a political cartoon depicted by a Southerner. You notice on the left, the strong government. What does the government rest completely upon? You can see on that big carpet bag, it says carpet bag and bayonet rule, basically representing military reconstruction. And on top of that is the solid South, crushing the South beneath them. On the right, you see the man tilling the ground. It says let them alone policy. And that is them basically burying carpetbagger rule. Of course, the victims of the end of this quote-unquote carpetbag rule and the bayonet, the victims are African Americans. Redeemers, those Democrats, finally returned the South closer to its pre-war status. For African Americans, for the freedmen, they were forced into something called sharecropping. Basically, you rent out the land from the landowner, and you pay him based upon the crops that you receive. This is also called tenant farming because you're renting the land from them. So at the end of the year, you would share your crops with your landowner, and that's how you paid your debts off. So really quickly, here is a good depiction of what it looked like. On the left, you have what a plantation looked like during the era of slavery. You see the master's house on the red dot on the left, then the slave quarters surrounding them, and then you have the entire plantation for them to work on. On the right, it's the same piece of land, but you simply have the sharecroppers or tenant farmers spread out across the plantation. The only real difference is that they have quote-unquote freedom, that they are no longer controlled by the landlord, or what we then used to call the slave owner. But really, their lives are the exact same. They grow crops for the benefit of the man who owns the land. And sadly, even then, at the end of the year, the man could change how much they owed him and charge them extra. Now imagine what happens if they have a bad crop collection. They would end up owing massive debts. The landowner would not forgive them of those debts, and so they just dig themselves deeper and deeper into what I would call financial slavery. So this process of sharecropping and tenant farming was no better economically for African Americans than was the process of slavery. Only now they don't get slave quarters, or they don't get somewhere to live, they don't get clothing, they don't get food, and they're simply at the whim of the landowner, just like they were the slave owner. So unfortunately, after Reconstruction ends, economically speaking, they're really not much better off than they were before the Civil War. And this leads us into an era with what we call Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws that segregated African Americans and whites in the South. It also restricted their ability to vote. And it was backed by a Supreme Court decision known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Whatever you do, please remember Plessy versus Ferguson. Skipping over the details of the case, Plessy versus Ferguson deemed segregation constitutional. It said as long you can keep the races separate as long as they are treated equally. As long as facilities and opportunities are provided for both races, it's okay to keep them separate. What this leads to is blacks being treated as second-class citizens. As we know, later in the 1900s, their schools were given hand-me-downs. Their schools were run down. Their school buses, older school buses, they were treated much worse than were the first-class citizen whites of the South. If any blacks who challenged their status would have been intimidated. And there were many methods of achieving this, as we know, the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. But the most common was, unfortunately, lynching. If an African American challenged their status, they could be lynched. They could be accused of a crime. And being lynched is being basically executed without a trial. One example is the picture I have depicted here of a man about to be burnt at the stake, and you can see the crowd there to watch it, and the word justice printed there. They did not really truly care for justice. What it meant was that they could keep blacks and other groups who supported them in fear of their lives. You can see on this chart the number of blacks being executed by lynching throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. And you can see that number peak toward the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. Why? Well, probably because this was a time period that they could set in stone that African Americans were second-class citizens. And after lynching was strongly practiced in that time period, the fear sets in, and they're much less likely to challenge for full equality. So by the turn of the century, blacks are not only being intimidated and treated differently and separated, but they also have their ability to vote taken away. These are included in Jim Crow laws. They're literacy tests. If you want to vote, you have to pass a test. If you want to vote, you have to pay a poll tax, where you have to pay a fee to even vote. Now, looking back at sharecropping, did they even have the money to pay to vote? The answer was no, especially when you combine that with the intimidation and fear. Then you have the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause said that anyone whose grandfather could vote before 1865 did not have to take literacy tests or pay poll taxes. In other words, whites who had the ability to vote before the war could skip those roadblocks, whereas the majority of African Americans could not. So all this to say, post-Reconstruction Jim Crow South was brutal towards African Americans, economically through sharecropping, legally through Plessy versus Ferguson and segregation laws, and then, of course, physically and politically through lynching and literacy test poll taxes and the grandfather clause. So this gets us on to other groups who are struggling. What about workers? Well, in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, right after the crash of 1873, many workers continued to struggle as businesses cut their wages. So railroad workers decided to go on strike. And one theme of labor conflict in the late 1800s is that the government steps in and helps out businessmen. President Hayes at that time sent in troops to stop the strike, causing widespread riots to break out, and over 100 people would die from it. What ends up happening is those railroad workers do not get their wage cuts. Instead, they simply have to go back to work in the same conditions without gaining anything. What about immigrants during this time period? So we talked about workers. What about immigrants? Well, specifically, Chinese immigrants in this time period were discriminated against. As they flooded California, many groups, including Dennis Kearney and his Irish fellows, harassed and killed their competitors for gold mines, for railroad building. And so Congress, because of what they considered, I guess, a threat to American culture, especially in California, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibits nearly all Chinese immigration until 1943. So the Chinese are the only group to be completely discriminated against and blocked from entering our country. Other groups from Europe receive quotas where we severely limit the amount, but Chinese are actually excluded from immigrating. So you'll see in this population chart on the left, in 1880, 1890, you see the amount of Chinese living in America only grow by nearly 2,000, whereas in other time periods you see massive amounts of growth between the dates. That tells you that the Chinese Exclusion Act was quite effective at keeping them out of our country. So back to that idea of corruption. Patronage kills a president. James Garfield waved the bloody shirt and was elected president. Unfortunately for him, a crazy man named Charles Guiteau, decided that he believed he had earned a job by supporting him. After writing him several letters and not getting a job, Charles Guiteau shoots and kills President Garfield. Because of Garfield's death, Chester Arthur and Congress passed a law called the Pendleton Act, which attempted to end patronage. So only 10% of civil service jobs end up being reformed and unavailable. But so politicians had to find a different way to handle politics and to get support. Basically, I'll go ahead and tell you it's lobbyists and businessmen, and it helps set the groundwork for why people call ourselves being part of the second Gilded Age, which is now it's businesses and bribery and money that they can make on their campaigns to help them win, and no longer handing out jobs. This brings us to the next president. So Chester Arthur is a one-term president who finishes out that of James Garfield. Then in 1884, you have a president named Grover Cleveland arrive. He was a reform governor from New York, and he really planned on cleaning up government during his time there. Unfortunately, after winning the presidency against James G. Blaine, after a very dirty campaign, he is forced to cave into patronage by his political party, and he ends up having to fire 2/3 of all federal employees. This is because the Republicans had controlled the federal government all the way back to 1856 since James Buchanan. So a lot of Republicans are done away with and replaced by Democratic people. Despite these challenges, he is dedicated to the laissez-faire government. Laissez-faire means hands-off government, limit regulations, limit taxes, limit the government's imprint on business and people's everyday lives. So how did he back up his attempt to reform? Well, he read every single military pension that people applied for. A lot of Republicans, remember, Republicans had the Grand Army of the Republic voting for them. He read every single petition for funds himself to make sure that it was legitimate, and not just so that they would not just be receiving money so that Republicans could get a vote. He also vetoes a bill that would have provided grain for Texas farmers who are struggling. It's not that he's heartless or mean. It's that he was dedicated to the government's role as simply an overseer of society and not meant to get involved in our daily lives and hand out things to people. It's funny to think of a Democratic president as someone not supporting of social reforms or social programs, but that is exactly what Grover Cleveland was and what he represented. So if you've been missing the idea of the tariff being a major primary national issue, well, this is the time period for you because it is back. Cleveland decides that he wants to lower the tariff to cheapen goods and limit the monopolies that are growing through this time period. Republicans, because that's what Cleveland wanted to do, tell workers and industrialists that if he wins and he lowers the tariff, it will ruin businesses across our country, that workers will lose their jobs. So Grover Cleveland is defeated in 1888 by Benjamin Harrison. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I don't know anything that Benjamin Harrison does in his presidency. I think that out of all the presidents, Harrison represents the Gilded Age best because there's not a single act I know that he condones or supports or any accomplishments he makes. Instead, Congress leads the way during his presidency. Republicans spend over $1 billion under Harrison's watch, the very first Congress to do so, led by Thomas Reed and future President William McKinley. They also create the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which had the highest peacetime tax rate in U.S. history. It's no surprise that the Gilded Age would have the highest peacetime tax rate. It's no surprise that the tariffs would be raised to such a point that goods would be more expensive for regular Americans, but businessmen would be able to make money hand over fist in this time period. So with that said, with the tariff being raised, many farmers and workers decide to combine to fight for their rights. And we'll talk about the Populist Party later, but the Farmers Alliance and many farmers who are struggling to pay all of their debts, just like back in Jefferson's day and just like farmers of the South throughout the pre-Civil War period fought higher tariffs, just like South Carolina. So farmers fight it again in the late 1800s. So they end up gathering together for what they call the Populist Party, and they draft something called the Omaha Platform. Farmers fought for, number one, tariff reduction, which would make goods cheaper. 2, a graduated income tax, that those with more money had to pay higher taxes. 3, public ownership of railroads and telegraphs. That's because railroads and telegraphs charge farmers higher prices than they charge businessmen. And they thought if the government owned it, then they had a better chance of being treated fairly. Number 4, direct election of the U.S. senators. Political parties chose what senators ran for the U.S. Senate, and regular citizens had no choice. 5, free coinage of silver. Basically, that would mean more currency would be available. If you combine coinage of silver and gold, then they would be able to pay their debts off easier. 6, low interest loans with crops as collateral. Basically, the government would be the financier of the farming industry, and they would hand out loans that would be easier to pay off than that the regular banks charge farmers. Number 7, allow farmers to store goods in federal warehouses. That's because if farmers had a really good year, all the crops had to go on the market because they had nowhere to store them, and that would cause massive price drops that severely hurt farmers. So this is the major ideas behind the what's going to be the growing populist party throughout this time period. So be sure you have a general idea of what farmers fought for and what they wanted to occur. In 1892, farmers chose the populist leader, James B. Weaver. They believed in him, and their faith was not rewarded with a presidential victory. However, they do find themselves winning 22 electoral votes, which for a third political party candidate is quite a big deal. What they hoped is, as workers were also being treated horrifically, that they would be able to combine their farmers' party with that of workers. The 1892 Homestead Strike, which we'll talk about later, was a big turning point for labor as well. And so if they were able to combine in 1896, maybe these populists could win the presidential election after all. So this brings us to the very end of the chapter, Cleveland, Depression and Backlash. Grover Cleveland wins re-election in 1892, and so he is the only president to serve two non-consecutive terms. But the problem is when he becomes president, his plans to be a successful president are crushed by angry farmers, angry workers, demand for silver coinage, an agricultural depression, and over-speculation. All this combines to lead to the Depression of 1893. Other than the Great Depression, the Depression of 1893 is considered the worst economic crisis. It gets so bad that the government is about to run out of gold to back our currency, which means that our government would have to declare bankruptcy. What Grover Cleveland decides to do is reach out to a banker known as J.P. Morgan and make a deal for J.P. Morgan to purchase gold to help bail out the American government. While this is not an evil deal, unfortunately, Americans see it as our government getting in bed with the quote-unquote Wall Street devil. Imagine government making a big deal with the pharmaceutical company to bail us out today. That would be the same attitude that Americans would have had toward J.P. Morgan. So even though J.P. Morgan simply bails out the U.S. government, and yes, he makes a little bit of money, but he saves from bankruptcy, Americans are convinced that business rules the government. It's hard to think after looking through this chapter that they were incorrect when you consider all of the corruption and mistreatment of regular people in this time period. Anyway, so the Gilded Age, we see many groups struggling, from farmers to African Americans to immigrants to workers. We see many different approaches to the government, but it doesn't seem like the government ever makes a true response to help people out. This sets the stage for several chapters from now with the Progressive Era, where the government finally listens to the people through Teddy Roosevelt and through Woodrow Wilson and passes laws to protect us from the businesses that had controlled our economy and our country for so long. Anyway, so this wraps up the Gilded Age chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message or, just maybe read your notes. Just kidding. Get back to me. Have a good one.